Hello, and welcome to episode 4 on What If the United States Split Overnight. Let's get started. So, to start off the episode, we have the extension of the two economic alliances, the Midwestern Alliance and the Eastern Coast Alliance. These two alliances will both gain new members. So, let's start with the Eastern Coast Alliance. The Eastern Coast Alliance will gain Georgia, Florida, and Quebec in their alliance. This makes sense as pretty much all these states share similar economic ideals, much like how the whole system formed in the first place, so their admission to the new economic alliance was inevitable. Quebec also joined the alliance to further secure their independence, as now they can't just rely on Canada for their economy. So joining this new alliance would help them out in the long run. Now going on to the Midwestern Alliance. The Midwestern Alliance's new members are Kentucky and Tennessee. I said last episode that these nations were new and were sort of figuring themselves out, so they sort of stayed out of the alliance so they can get themselves situated. Well, now they are situated, and so they decide, all right, now it's time, and they gladly join the alliance. So that's all that is for the new economic alliances, and we can move on to other things, mainly regarding the Lakota Sioux Autonomous Region in the Dakotan Federation. For around 2 decades now, this state had been under autonomy from the Dakotan Federation. You saw in episode 2 how this happened. Well, now the Dakotan Federation decides okay, we've given them enough autonomy, now it's time to prepare them for their independence. Because the Lakota Sioux was at first happy with autonomy, but now, since it's been a while, pretty much nothing has changed. So they're like, okay, it's independence or nothing. And the Dakotan Federation understands that they don't want this to be violent. They want to do it in a peaceful manner. So they go to the Lakota Sioux and they're like, okay, we will grant you your independence. So the Lakota Sioux will officially become an independent country. Now, do not worry about the Dakotan Federation. The Federation is still very centralized and very stable, so the independence of the Lakota Sioux will not affect them that much. It is one thing that was very expected within the Federation. Everybody knew that the Lakota Sioux would gain independence at some point, so, this isn't really a surprising change. Moving on. Now, last episode I hinted of Texas making its own economic alliance with states in its sphere of influence. Now, this episode, Texas is ready to implement it. It asks all of its states if they want to join in on this new economic alliance, and they all agree. So, Texas has officially created its own economic alliance that has joined in with the Midwestern and the Eastern Coast Alliance. Regarding Alabama, which alliance will Alabama join? Well, since Georgia is in the East Coast Alliance, and since Alabama is very close to Georgia because, well, Georgia basically saved Alabama, Alabama decides it's going to go ahead and join in on the Eastern Coast Alliance. The other members of the East Coast accept this because Alabama does have a coast on the Gulf of just the Gulf. I'll just call it the Gulf. They have a coastline on the Gulf, so they can engage in trade with the other nations quite nicely. So, with this, pretty much the entire eastern coast is now in its own economic alliance. But don't worry, these are just economic alliances. They're not military alliances. So no violence is going to happen at all. Now, real quick, we need to look at an update on the spheres of influence map because some major changes have happened. Mainly the fact that the Texan sphere of influence no longer exists because Texas has made its own economic alliance, therefore, it doesn't need to have a sphere of influence. California, on the other hand, still has its sphere of influence, but with one major change. The country of Cascadia is no longer in its sphere of influence. This is because Cascadia, being a Pacific nation with a coast, has become much richer after, After uniting, Cascadia has become much richer, and they decide, all right, you know what, we can do this on our own. We don't need Canada or California anymore. We can do this on our own, and they officially leave the Californian sphere of influence. Now, keep in mind, this isn't like an alliance type thing. They're like, hey, California, you don't need to send any more aid to us. We can do this on our own. And California is like, okay, good luck. So Cascadia is now on their own. So that's pretty much all the changes that occurred within the spheres of influence, and we can move on to Oklahoma. More specifically, the Indian nations inside of Oklahoma. Now, after the independence of the Lakota Sioux Nation, many Indian nations in Oklahoma decided, hey, maybe we should try our hand at autonomy. Because with the independence of Oklahoma, these nations were basically given zero representation. So that kind of pissed them off. So they were like, okay, you know what, we'll meet and we'll see what we can do with Oklahoma. So just like any other Indian nation, they go to Oklahoma and they ask if they could have autonomy. To which Oklahoma responds, you know what, since you make up half of our state, and the Indian nations could easily overpower the rest of Oklahoma. So Oklahoma is basically fighting a losing battle here. So Oklahoma says, "All right, fine, we will give you your autonomy." And the autonomy of all the Indian nations in Oklahoma is proclaimed. All right, moving on to a very minor border swap. So, for context, the Yellowstone National Park is a big old national park that is in between the states of Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho. This was not a problem as all of the states, people can move freely between states, so having it in three different states is not much of an issue. But now, since the states are independent countries, it has become an issue. Not immediately because the area that Idaho has is uninhabited, but the Dakotan Federation and Idaho decide, you know what, it might as well be in our best interest to have Yellowstone be in one whole state. So that's what they do. Idaho gives away a little bit of land to Montana in exchange for a few $1,000,000 or a few billion or whatever money. I don't really know how many purchases work nowadays because all the land purchases I know were like from the 1800s and stuff like that. So I don't really know how much money this will go for, but it is a very minor border change, but a very good one. Moving on to the Southern Federation. Now, what's going to happen with the Southern Federation? Well, a massive hurricane in the Caribbean is heading straight towards the Southern Federation, specifically the city of New Orleans. When the hurricane finally hits, New Orleans is completely devastated as it is right on the center of the hurricane. It does meet the eye a little bit, but still, it encounters the worst of the winds, and then the hurricane diminishes and is, completely shut off somewhere near Kentucky. But after this, the Southern Federation is completely and utterly it is just completely screwed at this point. New Orleans, the capital of the Federation, of the Southern Federation, is completely diminished. I will give you a look on how flooded the plains of Louisiana are. So, this is the flood damage from Louisiana. Of course, Louisiana isn't the only place got struck by this hurricane. Texas was pretty devastated too. I'll actually give you a little look on all the flood damage from this hurricane right over here. But this was the biggest hurricane ever. And the state that got hit the worst by it was the Southern Federation. I will give you a look on how the other countries were affected in a second. But this completely collapses the Southern Federation's economy, as their largest and most populous city was completely devastated. I'd say there be about 500,000 casualties in this disaster, which is a tragedy across the whole nation. Now I will give you a look on the other countries that got affected by this hurricane and how damaged they are. So this is the flood damage from all the other countries and states that have been affected by this hurricane. As you could see, Jamaica is completely devastated. Cuba has taken a chunk out of them from the waters. I think Mexico has lost Cancun, and Mobile, Alabama is damaged from this hurricane. And as you could see, it is very devastating. And also, I forgot to add Texas sort of has like a flood around its coastline right over there. So it's also pretty devastating. So this hurricane disaster, like I said a billion times before, is very devastating. But what would happen to the states after it? Well, they will all come together and make some efforts to sort of clean up all the messes and basically rebuild everything. So, Jamaica, Mexico, Texas, the Southern Federation, Alabama, Florida, and Cuba meet together and basically set aside their differences so that they can rebuild and, make everything better. Of course, in real life, this scenario is pretty much almost impossible. There's no way that US states and Cuba are going to work together. But this is a few decades in the future, so anything could happen. Cuba might be willing to work with them. Who knows? But what I do know is that this will be successful and the Southern Federation will recover from all of this. Moving on, we have the admission of Superior into Canada. Now, of course, this was a long time coming because Canada and Superior are very similar. They both share the same climate, all that stuff. And Superior is super close to Canada in the sense it has a lot of northern territories. And basically, a lot of things about Canada and Superior are the same. And also, Superior's copper mines have dwindled. So they decide, okay, we'll just join in with Canada. And they join in with Canada. And that's pretty much it for Superior. Now, moving on again to Eastern Nevada. Now, for context, last episode we saw Nevada joining California after the independence of Las Vegas. But now there is a problem. There are many Mormons living in eastern counties of Nevada, and they want to join in with Utah. But since eastern Nevada is pretty much just desert, California's like, okay, we'll give you a referendum and see if you'd want to join Utah. So, in 4 counties of Nevada, referendums are held on which if they want to join Utah or not. And here are the results. So, in the results of this referendum, all the northern counties voted no, and all the southern counties voted yes. So, with this settled, the new border can be set. Alright, so the new border of Utah and California is set, and the Mormons are now happier. So, maybe except for the ones living in northern Arizona. But we'll get to that in a later episode. Now, with this, we can conclude the 4th episode of the What If the United States Split Overnight series. So, to recap, we have the independence of the Sioux tribe, we have the extension of the Eastern Coast Alliance as well as the Midwestern Alliance. And also, just a quick side note, Superior will leave the Midwestern Alliance now that it's joined Canada. So now it's no longer a part of it's no longer a part of the Midwestern Alliance. We have the new autonomy of all of the nations of the Indian tribes living in Oklahoma. We have Texas making its own economic alliance. We have the devastating hurricane that basically wiped out all of New Orleans and the collaborative efforts of the Caribbean nations to try to rebuild. We have Washington Cascadia leaving the Californian sphere of influence, as well as Utah gaining some more lands. And that is pretty much it. So I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you guys in episode 5. All right, bye-bye.